Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this session on research evaluation, old and new challenges. First of all, I would like to thank very much our speakers today. We have two fantastic speakers, Bert Overlate and Dagmar Meyer. And I really would like to reinforce my acknowledgement. There has been a number of small technical problems, and thank you very much for your tolerance and for being here with us today. I now pass the word to my colleague, Karin Wall, who's going to moderate this session. Thank you.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Council of Associate Laboratories, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's session on research evaluation, old and new challenges. To open this session, just two very brief comments on the main motives which led the Associate Laboratory Council to organize this session on research evaluation. What, in our opinion, is at stake? Why do we, as researchers and as research labs, why do we need to promote debate, creative thinking, and mutual learning on this issue? Well, first, as we are all aware, there is an intense ongoing debate at European level, both top-down and bottom-up, on the need to reform the research assessment system, on the need to consider and come together on a new assessment process. As a result, over the last 3 or 4 years, we have witnessed the emergence of multiple position statements, recommendations, reports on how to advance evaluation principles, case studies, interesting case studies, reporting on new practices in different countries and scientific fields. Some of these are very well known to you. For example, just to mention a few, Science Europe's 2020 position statement on research assessment processes, the position paper by Leroux, the League of European Research Universities, on the assessment of researchers in 2022, the very interesting case report study by Dora Spark and EUA, the European University Association, Reimagining Academic Career Assessment, which tells us some short stories of innovation and change in assessment practices. And I should also mention the European Commission's recent scoping report called Towards a Reform of the Research Assessment System. This was a report presented by DG Research and Innovation in November 2021, and which involved a wide consultation of stakeholders. As you may know, it proposes a way forward in the form of a European agreement to be signed by funding organizations, research organizations, and national authorities and agencies. What is its main focus? Well, very briefly, to cite the executive summary, it says, the aim for research and researchers to be evaluated based on their intrinsic merits and performance, rather than on the number of publications and where these are published, promoting qualitative judgment with peer review supported by a more responsible use of quantitative indicators. My second comment is that it is important to open up this debate within the Portuguese science community, within the labs, within the universities, so that we understand the main challenges, understand also where we stand, and to what extent we are ready to innovate and change. So what are the main challenges under discussion? Reading through these statements and recommendations, it is obvious that we're talking about both old and new challenges. For example, the challenge of quantitative versus qualitative judgment is an old one, as you well know. The problem of moving beyond the counting of publications and journal impact factors goes back a long way. The San Francisco Declaration was published nearly a decade ago, and many funding and research institutions, and some of ours as well, have adopted new practices, self-evaluation reports, CV narratives, case studies of impact, etc. There have been countless efforts to establish a more healthy balance between quantitative and qualitative assessment practices. What seems new, however, is the drive to collect and disseminate all these alternatives in order to promote more widespread change and to promote more alignment on these issues. And also to promote more creative bottom-up thinking on these alternatives, to monitor them, to diversify them, to create new options. If this is the case, then Portuguese research institutions and agencies might also join efforts to create and disseminate new practices. Another new challenge, which is identified in this debate, is the need to provide more diversity and inclusiveness in research assessment. In other words, to have a more holistic approach to scientific performance and activities by taking into account not only the quality and impact of research results and publications, but also by broadening out assessment to include other dimensions of performance and activities, such as team spirit, leadership skills, competences related to public engagement, open science practices, skills related to managing and preserving data sets, managing infrastructures, just to mention a few of the more relevant dimensions. And of course, all this implies new ways of thinking about what is excellent and top quality science, since scientific practices are also undergoing change due to new trends and tendencies: open science, digitalization, multidisciplinarity, globalization, etc. Well, I don't have time to mention other challenges which are now on the table and will probably be mentioned by the keynote speakers, but we all know, for example, that the strain which is put on reviewers and assessment panels, and how to deal with this is an important challenge. And we also know that we have to strengthen the principles of integrity and transparency. Last comment to conclude. The Council's main aim in today's workshop is to begin by listening to speakers, organizations at European level who have been discussing, raising awareness, and seeking to promote or implement new practices. Additionally, we would also like to start discussing these issues and how they are being dealt with inside Portuguese universities and research institutions, and we hope in this way to open up the pathway for debate and improvement. Finally, I would also like to greet and give special thanks to our invited speakers, Bert Overlat, Dagmar Maia, Pedro Camanho, and Helena Pereira. Our first invited speaker is Bert Overlat. Thank you, Bert. I hope you are listening to us, for being with us today. Bert Overlat is Emeritus Professor and former Director of Human Resources of the Catholic University of Leuven, Department of Business and Economics. Bert has been closely involved in human resources development in higher education systems and strongly involved in the work of LERU, the League of European Research Universities. And currently, he's chair of an important policy group at LERU, the Careers of Researchers and Human Resources Policy Group. And his talk will be on a pathway towards multidimensional academic research careers. Our second keynote speaker, maybe we can hear Bert, and then I will present Dagmar and the other keynote speakers. So thank you very much, and I will pass the floor to Bert.
Thank you very much, Karen. There is a slight delay in the audio and the video in my respect, so I'll try. I hope this doesn't bother too much for you. Thank you very much for inviting me in this gathering, and I'm very happy that I can share some of that LERU experience with you that might be inspiring, might help you in your reform of research assessment. I was very interesting to hear that the careers work group or policy group of LERU is an important one because it was not considered to be important when I started with this group 15 years ago. But in the meantime, I think we understand that we are not only producing papers and patents, but also people, and the education and the spread of the research capabilities of people in all aspects of society is a very important academic endeavor, an academic duty, and an academic service to society. So I think this is true. It is very important. This subject is too important just to leave it over to external commercial players. And so let me give you a short oversight of what is happening inside of LERU and what kind of framework we have developed in LERU on the assessment of researchers. So the paper you referred to, I will just give a summary, and maybe there is room for discussion or for questions, and I will give you some more comments while presenting the main lines of this paper. Can I have the next slide, please? So the topic of assessment of researchers is, of course, a very important one if you're thinking about careers of researchers. And while we were discussing this, there were a couple of things that we felt were very important. The first one is that the assessment of researchers is something that is a core activity of research. It's a core activity of science. And if you go back to the history of science, it is the emancipation of scientific bodies from government and from religion was that they had their own system of assessing what was quality of what kind of research was considered to be qualitative and which was not. So I think the assessment is something that we should take back in a way, in the sense that we as universities should not leave this to commercial players who flood us with all kinds of types of data, and that we have to make the judgments for ourselves better and more than we do maybe today. The second concern we had, or a second goal, was that I must say we were a little bit tired of all the complaints about how things were going wrong, and we wanted to see what could the future look like. And I think it's very important not just to say what we don't want, but also what we do want. And so we started with exchanging all the novelties and innovations that were, and all the experiments that were taking place in LERU universities. And that was a big starting point for discussing how things could evolve even further in the future. And this is what I would like to share with you. The basic tenet, and I think this is something which is playing already for a long time in most universities and research organizations, is to be able to do justice to the wide range of profiles that we need today. Science is not individual anymore. It's not a single professor, a lonely professor who is in his ivory tower and maybe with a couple of assistants around him. No, this is more and more teamwork, is more and more happening in collaborative settings. And so what we need is people who can collaborate to this whole, and this is what the introduction also said. We have to take a more holistic approach to that and not just look at one indicator, which is, of course, much too narrow to capture this diversity of contributions. Next slide, please. So the paper develops three perspectives. I think the first is relatively traditional in the sense that the multidimensional perspective is something that was already there before we had metrics. This is the advantage of my age. I started my PhD almost 40 years ago, and more than 40 years ago. So it is, in that time, there were no metrics. So it was very simple. If you had to judge someone, then you had to read what he was writing. This multidimensional perspective is something that is already well developed within the universities, although, of course, there's always progress to be made. But I think the developmental and the contextual perspective are more novel and are more innovative, and I think we have to look at them more in detail within a couple of minutes. Yes, you may give the next slide, please. So in the most, if we're looking at the career frameworks, which are sometimes very detailed and elaborated, and in some other universities they're more broadly defined, we always find actually two major duties or two major criteria, two major domains in which academics are evaluated, which is research and education. And there's always a third one, and that's something else is defined very differently in different universities, but basically it comes to two types of service, I would say. One is service to the institution itself, as many, let's say, many jobs and functions within universities are dealt with by professors. Just a good example being having been the HR director for a while. And of course, also the public engagement, which now sometimes would be called public impact or impact to society. It's a direct link and direct service to society as such. I would just go briefly over that because the only thing I want to show is that this is already much more complex and much more wide and much more multidimensional than looking just at publications and certainly top publications. So the next slide gives an overview of a number of criteria that are used within LERI frameworks in terms of research. Can we have the next one, please? Okay. And you can say the top one is the contribution to the subject area, and publications is only one way of having a scientific impact and influence. It's not just publication itself, it's whether that you really have a word in the progress and in the continuum progress and advancement of your scientific field. What that exactly means may be very different from one field to the other. It's very different and very field specific, I would say. But there are other criteria like the recognition in the scientific community, which may come from prizes or from specific positions that may have in scientific communities. There is, of course, also the record in funding, whether that you are able to obtain research funding yourself. There's the collaborations. There is the aspect of interdisciplinarity, which has become much more important today, as we have seen in the COVID pandemic recently. But there's also research strategy. This is one of my favorites. I think what we need is not just people doing research, but build research lines, build research programs, because it's through research programs that are built on longer term that science really progresses and that fields do really progress. And then, of course, there's another one which is extremely important, is the advancement and enablement of junior researchers, because we just don't produce only patents and papers, as I just said, but the output in terms of young people that have been trained as researchers after their PhD, going back to society in different communities in a different context, have this scientific view and this research-like skills of the researcher skills that they bring in their jobs in industry or in government or in education. Next, please. So we see already that research is not just publications, on the contrary, and the same happens with education. Excellent education, good teaching scores or assessment of student performance is very good, but also development of learning tools and reflection on your practices and the curriculum development is a standard one. One that is less present at this time, but I think is becoming more and more important, is also to recognize the educational engagement outside the university. It may be in lifelong learning, or it may be in situations in which that professional bodies are supported in the educational, permanent education of specific professions like doctors or lawyers or whatever. And so these outdoor, let's say, the non-basic educational tasks become more and more important in several area universities, and I would think they will continue to become more important in the future. Next, please. Well, for the next slide, I would refer to the title of the symposium, which says all the new challenges, because these are a number of old topics that were already there when I was first applying for a professorship in Leuven. That is, that these are a number of services to society which are recognized already to some respect in many of our universities. Of course, in the medical sector, it is patient care in university hospitals, which is very important. We have the industry collaboration technology transfer activities, could be collaboration, could be creation of spin-offs or patent acquisition, but also advice and to government and to public policy, and is not that important. Scientific communication, public impact, which I think also has proven its importance in the recent pandemic. The engagement in professional bodies for professional practice, and also North-South development programs, which are always seen as an important element of the service to society at large from by LERI universities. And this, I think, are traditional forms of public engagement, and I think there are new now in terms of open science. We have citizen science, for instance, but I think this already covers a number of activities. The point is, are they sufficiently rewarded and recognized in the assessment process that we have so far? So these three simple lists of topics or of criteria, you might say, already indicate that in order to have a just and fair assessment, that we have to take into account of all these different activities, all these different engagements that researchers may have within our institutions, And then I didn't mention yet the institutional service, like being a dean or a department chair or having other tasks within the university context. Can we have the next slide? But beyond this multidimensional perspective, I think it's very important. We believe that the developmental perspective is much more important. And this is something which is only very informally present in the schemes or in the career framework that we have so far. That is that there are a number of topics that are mentioned here. There's leadership, which is something that we like to talk about. There's also collaboration. As I said, you have to manage collaborations. If you have large intersectoral or interdisciplinary collaboration, someone has to have the skills and also devote time to make sure that these collaboration work. They don't work from themselves, so you have to do so. Also, the aspect of innovation is very important, as people have to try new things and learn from the mistakes, and therefore make sure other people also can help them and be helped to find new ways in answering the issues that we are focusing on. So this development perspective basically says that people will not only grow in terms of content and their technical skill as a researcher, but also in their personal responsibilities and their personal skills, their interpersonal skills, that we have to acknowledge these also somewhere better in our perspective. It's not something like if you have a number of sufficient publication score, then it is a bonus to have these things. I think these elements, this personal development, is something that in the future will become more and more important and central to assessing researchers, because they will become the major driver for innovation, a major driver for collaboration, and make sure that we maintain our leadership, intellectual leadership. Next slide, please. And the third perspective is one that we also elaborate a little bit more in detail, is that the contextual perspective, and this is a very traditional discussion about performance assessment in general. It's not restricted to universities, it's also somewhere else, is how do you take into account the context in which this performance was made, right? And we know that excluding the context factors would lead to a systematic bias. But let's just take a very simple example. If you are a young researcher post PhD, 5 years beyond your PhD, and you finally get settled in a context of a large international lab with 25 professors and with equipment, world level equipment, or you are a researcher in the same field with the same background, and you are put into an university where they say, here's a budget and I'll make sure that we get something in this field. This is totally different. I mean, how can you compare these two performances without taking into account a complete different context? It's in the first, the challenges in both cases are severe, because in the first case, it's not just that you can serve around with the others who have already established themselves. You also have to find your own niche within that whole, within a larger institution. But in the other case, you have to be pioneering and finding out what works and what doesn't work in a way which is very different from the first case. So we believe that it's not just the personal context of the researcher, but also the scientific context and the institutional context of the researcher that should be taken into account in the assessment, which normally is not the case in the assessment of researcher. Next, please. Now, I think one of the reasons why the Larry paper was well received is that what we try to do is not just say this is what we need. We have now a very simple and a little bit, let's say, narrow-minded way of measuring performance, which is not a good way. So let's try something else. But of course, this is not so easy. And there are a lot of issues that were actually solved by using metrics. And these issues will come back if you quit metrics and try to be more qualitative and have a more inclusive way of assessing the contributions of your researchers. And one of the issues is that you can't be good in everything. Right? I can tell you that my application form without the references without the publication list was 50 pages. Nobody wants to read 50 pages of CV, so there is a huge gap between the fact that you can say, yeah, well, I did also that, and I did that, and you can't be good at all these topics. I mean, you have to choose your own niche and make sure that you can show what your strengths are, but there will be different profiles, okay? Comparing different profiles is not easy. If you have one measure stick, maybe it's not relevant, but at least you have a simple measure stick to compare different cases and different people. And in many cases, there is a sort of scarcity. There's only one position, or there's only one promotion, or a couple of promotions available. So you have to do a ranking of people and which kind of profile are you going to put on the highest level. So what kind of choices do you need to make? It's not so easy. It would be easier if you just could be able to measure everything, but I don't think that will work. And also the multidimensionality makes comparison between different profiles very difficult. So I think this will certainly take more time and more effort from the panels, and and it will also require a lot of communication to make sure that people don't expect them to do everything. Because that's one of the dangers, I think, especially for early career researchers, that they start to see all these criteria and say, oh, should I be good in everything? And they try to do everything at the same time, which is, of course, not a good idea. Another issue is that the developmental context is not easy to measure. So how do you assess that? There are some experiments within later universities about measuring leadership, but how do you measure people's capabilities and skill in terms of interpersonal collaboration? I think this is something that we further have to develop in order to have a sound basis for judgment and for taking this in when we are assessing our researchers. And there's a very fundamental question that has also been we posed a couple of times within LERU, and that is whether that this new way of assessment will have an impact on our international position, or whether it will weaken us. And this is one of the questions that is also discussed in the European reform, because if Europe would work differently in assessing its research performance than, for instance, the United States or Japan or China, it might lead to the fact that its performance is declining relatively to the other regions in the world. Next slide, please. Well, there are also in the paper, but I'm not going to go in detail, a number of examples from LERU and all kinds of experiments, and some of the examples and experiments are already many years from now. I have been ongoing for many years. So training panel members get to narrative forms of CVs, collect data on collaboration, review the diversity of contributions in your framework. These are things that are happening. So there are more examples. I won't go into detail here, and I would like to go to the final slide. Next, please. So the idea was that this would be an inspiring wake-up call in the sense that there are still a lot of things to do if we want to continue in this line of thinking, and if we want to improve and enhance the more inclusive form of assessment of researchers, but also at the same time inspiring. It helps. Hopefully, it helps you and all institutions, not only LERU institutions, to be inspired about what the options are, what possibilities are, and what possible solutions are for what you want to do. But of course, it is not simple, and so I like it's a standard line in any presentation I do now. It is the new assessment process will be complex, delicate, and messy. You don't expect it to be simple. Don't expect it to be one size fits all. We have to think about all the contexts, all the differences in fields, the differences in types of contributions. So it will be messy. It will be delicate in the sense that it will be prone to bias and to all kind of power games. So we have to make sure there's enough, there's enough attention to these aspects of the assessment process, and there should be more time invested in the assessment process than it is today. And the third general question or conclusion that I would like to share with you is that what we need is coherence in the ecosystem. So I'm very happy Leo is very happy that in the process of the European Commission, not only universities are there, but also funders like ERC, but also national funders like Science Europe, and also national assessment bodies, just like ACRS in France. So I think this is very important that these are there. Unfortunately, the member states are not yet on board, so we're looking how is that going to evolve, but I think it's very important that there is some alignment in all these initiatives so that those who lead are able to lead in the new way of assessing research, but without having secondary consequences by other players in the field, in the ecosystem, because they still adhere to the old style criteria. So this is something that we need to tackle as a whole, and this is a thing that we try to contribute in the European reform of assessment of research. So thank you very much, and I'm not sure if there is possibility for questions or discussion. I'm just looking at the moderator.
Thank you so much, Bert, for setting out with great clarity all these issues, the perspectives and criteria, and also the problems which we may face by trying to reform the system. Would you stay with us, because we will move on to the next two keynote speakers, and then we will have some time for debate at the end of the three keynotes. Okay, can you stay with us?
Thank you very much.
Okay, all right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So our next keynote speaker will be Dagmar Meyer. Meyer, are you with us? Dagmar?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Dagmar, for being with us today. I would just like to say very briefly, Dagmar Meyer is a mathematician, but she has long been involved in European science policies, in particular in issues related to scientific careers and mobility of researchers, gender and work-life balance. She is currently a policy advisor at the European Research Council Executive Agency. And Dagmar will be talking to us about ERC's implementation and the principles set out by DORA, the San Francisco Declaration. And so her talk will be on ERC and DORA principles, commitment and implementation. You have the floor, Dagmar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I suppose somebody is preparing the slides. Yes, thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And I will give you a quick run through how the ERC is, has committed and continues to commit to the DORA principles and is implementing them, and how this all fits into the broader framework of research assessment. So a few words about myself. As Karen already introduced me, I work at the ERC Executive Agency, which is the European Commission's agency to implement the ERC program, which, as you know, is part of Horizon Europe, or the Research Framework Program more generally. And I work in the unit support to the Scientific Council. So I work directly with the researchers who are actually in charge of establishing the strategy, the scientific strategy of the ERC program. Next slide, please. I don't think I need to say very much about what the ERC is. You are all very much familiar with what the ERC program is all about. Maybe just a very few key features. Of course, we're talking about long-term grants to researchers. So on average, 5 years, not these general, more short-term kinds of support, but really substantial funding for long-term grants to develop a substantial project. Open to researchers of any age, any nationality, from anywhere in the world. The only condition is that the research has to be carried out to the largest extent within Europe, so based at a European institution. And very important for our discussion here is that scientific excellence is the sole evaluation criterion, and I will say more about what that actually means in practice. Contrary to some other parts of the research framework research program that are also implemented by agencies is that we have a scientific council, which, as I already mentioned, is in charge of establishing the scientific strategy. And that includes everything related to the approach to the evaluations. Well, we only have one criterion, but then the actual items that are looked at during the evaluation, all that is in the hands of the Scientific Council. And the Scientific Council is supported by the agency, as already mentioned. One very important aspect is scientific freedom, is really a key principle of ERC funding. So the support goes to individual scientists. Legally, it goes through the institution, but at the end, it's really support to the scientists individually. We're not supporting consortia or that kind of funding that is more common in the rest of the framework program, but it's all individual based. It's completely bottom up. Essentially, the sky is the limit. There are no predetermined subjects. We are open to proposals from all fields of science and humanities, with a very small exclusion for nuclear research that would fall under the Euratom program. Very important selection of proposals is on the basis of international peer review. There are no political factors that play into the selection of grants. And in the context of scientific freedom, also very important is the portability of grants. So researchers who feel that the host institution that they have chosen doesn't give them really the freedom to develop their ideas as they would like, have the possibility to move the grant to a new institution. Next slide, please. So while I'm sure everybody in the room knows very well how the ERC works, maybe when it comes to DORA, of course, DORA has been around for a long time, but then quite often you talk to people and they say, yes, of course, DORA, I've heard about it, but I'm not quite sure what does it actually mean, what does it stand for? So it's actually a set of recommendations addressed to a broad variety of stakeholders. So it addresses funders, like the ERC, for example, research institutions like universities, but also publishers, metrics providers, and very importantly, researchers themselves. Researchers are involved in the ecosystem in many, many different ways. On the one hand, of course, there's the individuals who carry out a research project, but researchers are involved in everything else as well. They are panel members for funders. They are in hiring committees in institutions. They work as editors and peer reviewers for publishers. They are really omnipresent in the system, and that's why it's very, very important to understand that DORA, more than anything else, really addresses the researchers, because they are the ones who ultimately take the decisions. So DORA was not developed by researchers, but by a group of editors and publishers at a certain meeting, 2012 in San Francisco. That's where the name comes from, which is actually interesting in itself. Because maybe 10 years ago, researchers were not so outspoken and well, hadn't really found their voice yet to say there's something wrong with the way outputs of scientific research is evaluated in the different contexts, be it for funding applications, be it in the institutions. So it's kind of interesting that the DORA principles were actually developed by a different stakeholder group. But be that as it may, the headline principle, as everybody knows, is, to summarize it very quickly, don't use the journal impact factor. So that's basically old news. What exactly does it mean? I've put here the headline principle. I've spelled it out. It means basically you should not use it as a surrogate measure for the quality of individual research articles, individual researchers, etc. It's in that sense that the principle says do not use the journal impact factor. In practice, it has often been interpreted as a complete ban of the impact factor, but of course, at the end of the day, we're all interested in the responsible use of metrics, and applying the journal impact factor to use it to say one researcher is better than another because he or she has published in journals with a higher journal impact factor is not responsible. But it's the idea in principle was not an outright ban in each and every possible situation. Next slide, please. So there are two recommendations addressed to funders, and they are almost the same for research institutions with the obvious changes. So the first one is all about transparency. And this is something I think Karen also mentioned it in her introductory words, that it's very, very important to be clear about what your criteria are, what do you expect as a funder, what do you expect from your applicants. If the instructions are not clear as to what people should put into their application, then it's not fair to them if you afterwards evaluate them on something else. Part of that first principle recommendation to funders is, to put it in simple words, the content is more important than the packaging. In other words, funders should be very clear, especially when addressing early career researchers who may not yet have the experience of more senior colleagues, that it's very, very important that the content of a paper is scientifically well-founded, that the methods are rigorous, that basically that it's a scientifically excellent paper, even if it has not been published in a journal that is within a certain whitelist or whatever in different parts of Europe and more generally people come up with. So that's really the key message. The content is what is important and not whatever journal or venue this has been published at. And of course, this principle has been formulated in the world of research, in the world of journals, but you could apply exactly the same for other types of publications, be they conference proceedings or be they books. Of course, in many scientific disciplines, books are much more important than journals, so of course the same principle applies there as well. And the second principle addressed to funders is about valuing all kinds of research outputs going beyond, and that means way beyond just research publications. So the principle itself only lists data sets and software, but that is already quite restrictive. And again, this was formulated about a decade ago. Of course, nowadays we know that well, probably people knew it at the time as well, but now it's clear that other kinds of outputs, be it algorithms, be it policy papers, be it prototypes, can be and are just about as important as publications. It's not all about publications. As was also already mentioned, the kind of impact that these outputs have can also be multiple. They can be scientific impact, really moving forward the frontier of science, and that's what the ERC is primarily interested in. But depending on the kind of funding scheme you're talking about, other types of impact will, of course, just be as important. For example, influence on policy and practice, as mentioned here. Next slide, please. So how has the ERC been dealing with this? I would like to give you a quick run through the timeline, and I'll be very short. So, of course, 2012, the principles were developed and 2013 published. And at that time, the ERC board actually already discussed them and thought about what are we going to do about this? Can we endorse these principles? Are they meaningful for the ERC? Do we actually comply with them? Are we actually aligned with them? And at the time, there was a little bit of hesitance because the board at the time wanted to be careful about not making a statement before really having discussed them in depth and really checked whether the ERC's own operations are in line with them. However, already at the time, about half of the council, including the president at the time, Helga Novotny, endorsed the DORA principles in a personal capacity, and in several cases, even including their affiliation with the ERC. So if you go to the website, you can see Helga Novotny signed in her function as president of the ERC, already back in 2012. The discussion continued somehow in the background. It was always in the back of people's minds. In general, it became a little bit quiet around DORA until at the 5th anniversary, there was a bit of a revival, and it moved back into the media, social media in particular. And that's also when the discussion picked up again more intensely at the ERC, and the Open Science Working Group of the Scientific Council looked very closely into the topic and said, we should really make sure, check, validate whether our procedures and ways of doing things, whether we are aligned, and if not, what we can do to become better aligned to these principles. And then, of course, also to make a public statement about this. So there was a detailed scrutiny of all the documents concerned, from the work program, information for applicants, peer review guide, panel briefings, etc., to see whether there was anything where there was a significant discrepancy. And we were very happy to see that really there wasn't any big problem. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and you can always tweak things in a little bit. But broadly, the ERC's approach was already very much in line with the DORA principles. So in late 2020, the Scientific Council then decided to actually endorse DORA by officially signing it. And it was then discussed whether this should be made public straight away. And the decision was to wait until the publication of the next work program, because in that work program text, several improvements had been made in the part relating to the PI's track record, because that was the ERC's response to those few areas where it had been discovered that things could be improved and further aligned to the DORA principles. And you must know that the gestation period of the work program is almost as long as for human beings. So the discussions start around October, then intensify in the meeting in December. And in the spring, then the work program is adopted by the Scientific Council and then finally published before the summer. So it made sense to wait until all these changes had been made in the document, in the key document, the work program, but also in some downstream guidance documents with the public announcement of the endorsement. Next slide, please. And before I say something about how this was then actually done, just to remind you that actually the ERC, as I already mentioned, was already very much aligned to the DORA principles. For example, in terms of avoiding bias in the evaluations, so unconscious bias training, well, training is maybe saying a little bit too much, but a certain small training module is included in the panel briefings. Gender issues are constantly addressed. The Scientific Council also has a working group on this. Different schemes, there are different schemes for different career stages, because it doesn't make sense to ask junior researchers to compete with more advanced researchers. That seems obvious, but still there are funders out there who throw everybody into the same pot. And the host institution is not evaluated. And that is actually very important, especially in the context of what was mentioned before. Some institutions have the means to provide the latest equipment, and some others have more modest resources. As long as the institution agrees to host the project and makes a commitment to host the project, the institution is then not evaluated in any further way. So that is an attempt to also address this kind of bias that might sneak in. Career breaks and unconventional research career paths are taken into account. And that is an evolving area. So career breaks, of course, everybody thinks of maternity leave and maybe mandatory military service. But of course, there are many ways why researchers may need to interrupt their research career or slow down for whatever purposes, for example, caring for family members with special needs, etc. And this is an area where there's a lot of discussion ongoing because new challenges are coming up for researchers in the current context of what is unfortunately going on in some parts of Europe, notably in Ukraine, where researchers have to flee their country because of the military aggression by Russia. These are things that are being discussed, how to support those researchers so that they are not disadvantaged because of these things that are happening. And finally, also the evaluations are monitored very closely in different ways from the side of the agency, but also from the side of the scientific council. So there are observers in the panel meetings from the council to make sure that really the evaluation process adheres with fundamental principles of DORA, but basically following best practice more generally. Next slide, please. So to tell you now what were the changes in the latest work program 2022. First of all, the journal impact factor was... Hello?
Sorry, Dagmar, it was just, do you think you could wrap up in a few minutes? Sorry, we don't have much time. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I will be done in 1 minute.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So the journal impact factor, it was made clear that this should not be mentioned anymore in the track record. It was clarified that beyond whatever is listed explicitly in the work program, applicants are free to include any scientific achievements that they deem relevant for their research project and their research area, because we fund research from all areas, and of course, whatever is relevant in one area may not be relevant in another. So it's up to researchers to decide what they want to put forward. And in that context, it's also very important, and this also ties in with what Bert said about the contextual dimension. PIs can provide a short narrative. We don't have a narrative CV, but specifically about the research track record, a short narrative can be included where the PI can explain why that specific achievement is actually important and what his or her contribution has been. And in that instance, then, of course, also specific contextual details can also be mentioned. And already before, there was a limit on the number of publications that could be included in the track record, because the question is about quality and not quantity. So all these changes ensured that things were even further aligned with the DORA recommendations. And if you move on to the next slide, just to say a few words about, as I already said, DORA is just one small part of the discussions that are ongoing. And the ERC is very much involved in many events, discussions, working groups, webinars, you name it, both our president, but also council members in national contexts. The ERC is represented in the core group of organizations that work on the drafting of the agreement on reforming research assessment that Karen also mentioned in her introduction. And there is a dedicated task force looking towards the future, how the ERC could potentially further improve the evaluation procedures as we have them now. And that's all I have to say. On the next slide, I have included a few references if anybody wants to follow up on them later on. And if you go on one more, there are some links to other useful resources. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dagmar, because the ERC has really been a guide to our reform in evaluation, and all those that have participated in your research evaluations have always learnt a lot. So it'll be good to see how we can move still further with your help. And please stay with us for the questions in about 15 minutes. So now I'll give the floor to Pedro Camanho. Pedro Camanho is also a member of the Council of Associate Laboratories Executive Board. Pedro is a professor at the Department of Mechanical Engineering of the University of Porto. And he is currently president of LAETA, Associate Laboratory in Energy, Transportation and Aeronautics, and vice president of ENG, Institute for Science and Innovation in Engineering. And his talk will be on evaluation in Portuguese universities. You have the floor, Pedro. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking the Council of Associate Laboratories and the organization for the invitation to give this talk. And let me start with some motivation. So this is a report that was coordinated by an alumni of the University of Porto, Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, entitled Cohesion in Europe Towards 2050. And you can see in this picture the category of regions in terms of GDP that defines the less developed regions of Europe. And you can see that in Portugal we are mainly in red, except the Lisbon region and the Algarve, and we also see the same scenario in the west of Europe. So this should cause some concern, but I think that the next picture should cause even more concern, because then you can see the growth of the GDP per head in different regions, and you can see that the west of Europe is growing and Portugal is not growing as it should. So, and of course, the idea of this talk is not to discuss the root causes or the things that we need to do to address this state of affairs, but I think we'll all agree that there's an urgent need to attract and retain talent to tackle this problem. And of course, this was mentioned in the report that was prepared by the Minister of Economy in terms of the usage of the Recovery Fund, and also it was elaborated in depth in Yuval Hariri's books as well. And this was something that some countries that have very significant natural resources also understand. For example, in Saudi Arabia, that currently has the most valuable company as of last week. So Aramco overtook Apple as the most valuable company. So in Saudi Arabia, they created the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. So you have this link that you can have additional information recently. With the focus, of course, in attracting the best scientists and in retaining the best scientists. So I had the opportunity to visit KAUST twice, and of course they have state-of-the-art buildings, state-of-the-art equipment, but these are things that money can buy. But what they actually did was to establish a very robust method to attract and to retain the top researchers. So you see that countries with strong natural resources, such as Saudi Arabia, realize that talent is the new oil, okay? So, and of course, to attract and retain talent, of course, the evaluation is a critical aspect. And when we talk about evaluation in Portuguese universities, we are mainly talking about the evaluation of faculty and researchers, right, in two dimensions, in hiring and promoting processes, and also in the annual evaluation that we as faculty and researchers have to face on a yearly basis. So what I'll do next, in the next slide, is really to share some thoughts about some challenges that we are facing in the hiring and promotion process, then also in the annual evaluation, and then I'll move to some suggestions towards different sets of practices. So starting with the challenges in hiring and promotion, of course, the first one, I think most of you are aware of this. So it's impossible to distinguish between hiring and promoting. And I believe that it's very difficult to manage an institution where you don't know if when you open a position, you're going to hire a new collaborator or you're going to promote. So it's very difficult to manage human resources. It's very difficult to manage a budget. So this is something that I believe it's a challenge that should be taken into account. So the other one is that we don't have a predictable career path for faculty and researchers. So here I've shown you the different positions at Imperial College London. So this is a place where I did my PhD. So you can see the different levels from lecture all the way to professor. And the way that the process works at Imperial College is that on an yearly basis, so the faculty and researchers can apply for promotion, or the department can make proposals of faculty that they think that should be promoted. And then that process moves to another stage where there's an evaluation at the college level, and the faculty are fully aware of the criteria, and the criteria are education, research, leadership and management, profession and practice. And for each one of these criteria, you have the metrics in terms of activities, measures of recognition, and progression requirements for each one of these ones. So everything is public. It's actually in that link that I've included, so if you're interested, you can download. But there's a predictable career path, and the faculty researchers are fully aware of what they have to do in terms of being promoted. Now, the other problem that I see is that there's a lack of accountability and very few checks and balances in the hiring and promotion process. So whenever I hire or I promote someone, I should be accounted for, and I should be responsible for the development of that particular person. So I think that this is something that we should also try to address in the future. Now, the other problem that I see is that I believe that we use an archaic method for hiring and promotion based on public notices that, in my opinion, promotes inbreeding. And I'm not the one saying that. I think that you all know these headlines from Público in 2017, and we should think about what the press is writing about the inbreeding levels at Portuguese universities. And let me elaborate a little bit more on this method, because I think there are, let's say, at the very least, a lot of opportunities for improvement. So, since this is a meeting about science, I think I have to have at least one hypothesis, and my hypothesis is that the degree of scientific maturity of a given institution is inversely proportional to the degree of quantification used in the promotion/hiring processes. Now, to test my hypothesis, I'll give you two examples of two evaluation processes where I was involved. So the first one at the Portuguese university, so ranked over the number 550. And you can see that we have different criteria. For each criteria, we have different parameters. For each parameters, we have weights. And I mean, this is not aligned, in my opinion, with the best practices, with these narrative CVs. I think this is a strong constraint, very strong boundary conditions of the personal career of someone that applies for a position or for a promotion. And also that does not leave enough room for the evaluators to evaluate with some discretionary power as well, okay? Now, if you compare this with another evaluation exercise that I was involved, so in this case, it was a position for a full professor in a university that is in the same ranking between number 1 and number 5, and basically here, what they ask is research record of high order, teaching, a record of effective teaching, good citizenship, a record of involvement in university and college administration, and demonstrable competence in such administration. So, and then I'm asked to comment and to write a well-fundamented report on the quality and international reputation of the research. So there's no H index, there's no impact factor, there's no number of papers, there's no Excel, okay? So with that, I think it's fair to conclude that we often use excessive quantification, in my opinion, often of the wrong parameters, with little consideration of quality, okay? So then I believe that there's an insufficient control of potential conflicts of interests. For example, when I'm asked to revise a paper, if I have a joint publication or some collaboration with any of the authors, I cannot revise the paper, right? But I can be in a committee where my PhD students or former PhD students are applying, or where my collaborators are applying. So I think we have to take into account potential conflicts of interest. For example, ERC has a very good method to identify and to control conflicts of interest, and I think we should do the same. Then, on a more practical side, there's one requirement that is often used. I know that this is not the case for all universities, but for some universities it is the case, that the applicants are asked to have the PhD degree certified at the application stage. So imagine that you have someone that is in Stanford, in Palo Alto, that wants to apply to a position, an assistant professor in Portugal, and he or she needs to certificate the degree at the application stage, not when the position is offered. So I think this limits really the possibility to attract international candidates. Another thing that we should think is the requirement of habilitation for the position of full professor. So if you have a Nobel Prize applying for a Portuguese university, he or she cannot get a position of full professor because it needs to have the habilitation. So something to think as well. Another aspect that I think is critical is that the candidates often are not interviewed. So we are hiring people for positions of assistant professors with all the responsibility that is at stake with this position, and we just base our evaluation on reading one CV. I think this is clearly insufficient. Now, in terms of the annual personal evaluation, the other evaluation that faculty and researchers have to face, so again, I think it's excessively quantitative. So number of papers, number of co-authors, number of projects, number of courses, number of students, with insufficient consideration of the quality of the activity. So for example, if I fail 95% of my students, or if I'm a lousy professor, it doesn't matter. What it counts is number of courses, number of students. And then again, it's based also on impact factor, and it was said before in the previous presentation, and I'd like to repeat this, that impact factor of a journal must not be a surrogate for the scientific relevance of a paper. And I'd like to show you an interesting example of exactly this situation, showing a paper entitled The Rational Analytical Theory of Fatigue, written by Paul Parry. So I work on fracture mechanics of polymer composite materials, so I'm very aware with the impact of this paper. So this paper resulted in what is called nowadays the Parry's Law, and this paper was published in the early 60s, and the paper was not accepted in the main journals of the time. So it was published in a very obscure journal entitled The Trend in Engineering. Now, this paper was really disruptive. It had a huge impact on society, and we wouldn't have nice aircraft or safe nuclear power plants or nice bridges in Portugal or fast trains without the science that was published in that paper. So you see, in a journal with no impact factor, a scientific work that had a huge implication in society, and if all parties were to be evaluated based on the impact factor of this journal, you'd be still today an assistant professor, I guess. So this is something that we need to take into account. Then the process of annual personal evaluation can be conducted without any interviews, definition of objectives, no follow-up. And then same criteria for different stages in the academic career. So I think this is probably one of the most important points, because I believe that, as full professor, I have to be evaluated with criteria such as, for example, the way that I promote the scientific development of the young researchers. And we cannot have the same criteria for full professors and assistant professors. So we cannot be in a situation where one size fits all. Then the other problem that I see, and again, this is published in Publico back in 2019, is that we see high percentage of top marks, okay? So this is data from Publico. And I think that if you have 80% of faculty that are evaluated as excellent, that, in my opinion, puts at stake the credibility of the evaluation process. And I think it's a fair question to ask then where are the RC grants, the international scientific prizes, the memberships of editorial boards of scientific journals, and so forth, okay? Finally, the effort is of little or no consequence. So if I'm evaluated as an excellent, I expect a pay rise, right? So, but I can probably see something in the long term, but I would say that the whole effort has little consequence, at least in the short term. Okay, so these are the challenges, but of course we have to come out with some suggestions to tackle these challenges. And I think this is not working. Okay, it's working now. So in terms of suggestions to tackle these difficulties, so I've divided suggestions in 3 levels. So level 1 are the suggestions or urgent actions that can be implemented in the short term. So you can implement this tomorrow. So the universities in Portugal can do this tomorrow if they want to do that. So the first one is to invite top independent international scientists to the evaluation committees. So I think that it's an axiom that you all agree that excellence breeds excellence and mediocrity promotes mediocrity. So we should have international, as much as possible, international scientists in the evaluation committees. So the other point is that we must ensure coherence between admission requirements and composition of the evaluation committee. So I've been confronted with situations where, for a promotion, the candidates must have an H index of 25 or I don't know how many papers and these projects. And then when I look at the evaluation committee, they don't fulfill this requirement. So that puts at stake the credibility of the whole evaluation process. So the other point is that I believe that the use of external reviewers should be mandatory, and that the candidate should submit up to 5 papers for review with a clear description of the contribution to the paper and a summary of its importance of its originality. No more than 5. And then these 5 papers are sent to top external reviewers that then will comment. And for example, coming back to Imperial College, the regulations at Imperial College state that one external reviewer must be a fellow of the Royal Society or a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society or equivalent, just to ensure the quality of the reviews. Again, we have to avoid possible conflict of interest. We have to look at co-authorships in recent years, being advisor of the candidates and so forth. I think this is something that we should do also in the short term. And I believe that we should have a mandatory interview, a lecture, and a research seminar. Okay, so this is something that we can implement in the short term. So finally, I think we should minimize the bureaucratic burden of the candidates and promote international applications. So level 2, so urgent reforms that require a strong political commitment. So I'd say that this is for the long term. So the first one is I believe that we have to have more slack, higher autonomy of the universities in the hiring and promotion processes. We have to establish a timetable for promotions based on merit, not of opening of a few positions, and we don't need to invent anything new. So we can have a department committee or individual applications, extensive use of external, national, international, independent referees. The applications should be fully discussed at school committee with the dean and final disposition by the rector. Replace the current method of annual personal evaluation by a personal review and development plan that should include a meeting with the head of department, identification of objectives, difficulties, and corrective actions, subjective to timelines if required. And the annual review must have consequences in terms of salary and awards and so forth. So the final thing that I've called wishful thinking, or maybe not, is really something that I'd like to discuss, and this picture that I've created is based on a fascinating book written by Frédéric Laloux. The title is Reinventing Organizations, and in his research, Frédéric Laloux demonstrated that 3/4 of the employees are completely disengaged from their work and organizations. And this is transversal. It's not only universities, it's hospitals, it's industries. People are tired of politics, silos, bureaucracy, competition, lack of purpose. Now, and if you look at the way that the organizations were run throughout different levels of human development, so starting with the tribal organization of society, where everything was based on a boss that ruled based on fear, so just one person setting the rules and everybody following, then to traditional, where you have a hierarchy, very much as the military system, then more recently scientific and industrial, where innovation is important and you have to have some sort of meritocracy, or more recently in the postmodern or information age, so the values and the empowerment. But still, with all this evolution, we still face this problem. And my final message is that I think that we as academia, we need to be at the forefront in terms of thinking the new ways that our organizations are managed to tackle these problems. And I can say that there's some pilot projects in one Belgium university where they are really trying to manage differently. For example, there's one pilot project in one department of engineering where really they're trying to promote collaborations rather than competition between colleagues. So, and this is something that we really should try to address and to show the light and the way forward. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I think you're really proposing an in-depth reform of evaluation in Portuguese universities, so this is a very good beginning. Pedro, would you like to come here? We have 10 minutes for a round of questions. I had hoped we'd have more time. So, yeah, Teresa, and I'll take 2 or 3 questions at the same time. Somebody else? Yeah, Claudio? Yeah, sorry, Pedro, yeah. Okay, Teresa.
Yes. Well, for one quick comment, I've been evaluating research in France for 10 years. And one thing that struck me in the beginning, and now I accept it totally, and I think it would be interesting, is besides the metrics that are usually used, they really assess by the way the researcher presents what he's willing to do and the narrative he does. They discuss if it's fit for the team or not and stuff like that. So it enters the psychological issue that represents the profile we want, either leadership or just teamwork or whatever. Which leads me to the question, who evaluates the evaluators? Okay, so we are talking about evaluation of people that are generally young and good. Sometimes they publish a lot, but they are selfish and very egocentric. Other times they are very cooperative and they create groups. Either way, maybe we want the selfish one, maybe we want the other one. But who are really these evaluators?
Thank you. Important question. Yeah. Claudio?
I don't really have a question, but it could be formulated as a question. I participated in the evaluation of the FCT in 2007. I coordinated a 382 units evaluation, and I learned lots of things. And then I worked with Karen in designing a guideline for evaluation. And now I'm in an institution of research. And institutions of research, I think we have to be a bit careful, because everything was said here is correct. But we have to be absolutely sure of one thing, is that the enter of any of this ecosystem is research. And research, to be evaluated, to carry out correct evaluation for research, there are no metrics. There is no way to do it in the sense of it has to be an individually personal thing. There are people who are completely wonderful colleagues and wonderful scientists, but there are people who are despicable colleagues and geniuses. And the point is that if you want to have the best, in any institution, being that university or being that a research institution, purely research, it's research at the center. All the other issues to do with public engagement, transfer of technology, impact in society, there are things that some people do very well, but other people don't. So that's what I said, it's not a question, but it's, what I would say is, what I'm learning at the moment by running a large institution is that assessment is an individual event. The real problem that we have to deal with is another one, which is how do we, in terms of time, renovate our researchers within the institution? That is the real question. How do we bring people in, knowing that we have a finite number of places? So some people have to go out. Some people, so can I accept, for example, hiring lots of researchers and half of them ending up doing communication in science? But they were not hired for doing communication in science. They were hired to do research. So there are certain issues here that are not simple to resolve. And they require a lot of courage. And if we don't want our institutions in the next 5 years or so to completely crystallize and fix all the places for the next 20 years, we have to be very careful how we do it. And it may end up being having to take very strong and very complicated decisions. But if you look at some of the greatest places that do science, they do not give tenure positions to everyone. They don't. They just don't. So the question that I leave here is that how do we reconcile this really crucial issue, which is renovation, renovation of an institution in the context of evaluation of researchers.
Thank you, Claudio. Pedro? Ileana, would you like to join us? I'm sorry. Ileana, wouldn't you like to? No? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Pedro.
Thank you. Well, I have just a very simple question. I know that research evaluation is a very difficult topic, and we do take it very serious in my university, University of Porto. But besides that, I want to make a precise question to Dagmar from ERC, which is having a change of hearts, how to evaluate the candidates. I want to know if there is some work done to make sure that this is being implemented. I mean, meaning, questioning the people that participate in the panels to know how much they are incorporating the new ways of evaluating the candidates. That's a very precise question.
Thank you, Pedro. Dagmar and Bert, are you listening to us?
Yes.
Dagmar, there was a question for you. Would you like to begin in relation to these questions? So who evaluates the evaluators, the question of renovation, and how do you monitor the implementation and whether reviewers are incorporating these principles?
Yes, maybe I will start with the last question. Can you switch off the microphone because there's such an echo? Okay, I think it's okay now. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, first about the last question about how do we make sure that whatever changes, improvements are programmed, let's say, at the level of the Scientific Council in our work programs and downstream documents and so on. How do we ensure that this is actually taken on board by the panels? Of course, we can only try to do our very best, but we have very competent panel chairs, and we are in very close interaction with the panel chairs, of course also with the panel members, but the interaction isn't as strong. And the panel chairs, for example, come together in Brussels, well, lately online, but normally they come to Brussels at the beginning of the evaluation cycle and in the end, the final panel chairs meeting. And for example, the last final panel chairs meeting was dedicated entirely to the topic of DORA and research assessment more broadly. And there were very good discussions about exactly this kind of question, how to make sure that all the good intentions are actually put into practice. So there is direct feedback from the panels and back again through this kind of mechanism. On the question of who evaluates the evaluators, of course, that's very difficult because how far do you go? Who evaluates the evaluators of the evaluators? But of course, as I mentioned, and I couldn't go into any detail, we have a multifaceted monitoring procedures. Our scientific officers are very well trained. They are present during the evaluation panel discussions, and when if they notice that a discussion is going off the rails and one of the panel members, and it does happen from time to time, I mean, nobody's perfect, somebody actually makes a comment like, well, but that applicant is better because the journal impact factor this and that, or that one has published in Nature and Science and the other one hasn't, then the scientific officers actually do step in and in a very objective way and just explaining this has nothing to do in the panel discussions. Please abstain from making this kind of comments. And again, also our council members do assist to panel meetings as observers, report back to the full scientific council, and if and when there are any issues detected, then that is being followed up. So the process isn't perfect, but we do as we can to try to make sure that people stick to the rules in that sense, to the principles.
Thank
and
you.
on the on the other point, I think I will leave it to Bert to comment on that, because it is really more about research institutions.
Thank you so much. Bert, would you like to comment on any of these questions?
Yes, thank you. I would first like to comment on the speech of Pedro when he was talking about all these issues like inbreeding and issues with potential conflicts of interest, etc., etc. I think many of the examples that you gave or the suggestions you made are implemented at most liberal universities already for a long time. I just give you one example from my university. We had an issue that there was often no international candidate. And so at some point in time, we decided that if there was not a valuable candidate from outside the country, there would be no post assigned. So if you had someone from the inside, but you didn't have a valuable candidate from the outside, the inside person was not did not get the position. And this took 2 or 3 years, and then everybody understood and went to look for good international candidates that we're competing with our internal candidates. So I think some of these relatively easy measures can be taken and will make a huge difference within a couple of years, because the whole culture will change. And I think these are extremely good suggestions. Now, regarding the question of the mix and on the renovation of the research base, I think there is, of course, most universities have an extremely high level of mix and renovation on terms before you get tenure. And sometimes it takes very long to get tenure in German countries. Most people are already at the end of their 40s or even their 50s before they get tenure. And there is a tendency to bring that closer to the beginning. But I think the issue is not tenure. I think the issue is, first of all, that the question that this gentleman was saying is that how do you get the right mix? Of course, it doesn't make any sense to have only people who are doing impact by science communication. So I think what we need is to make sure that if you hire a new professor, for instance, that this professor is complementary and sufficiently complementary to the team that's already there and has potential of contributing to this team. That means it's contextualized. It's not an absolute quality. And very often we have to make a very difficult choice between 2 or 3 candidates, which are all 3 excellent candidates, but with a very different profile. And we have to make a decision as an organization which profile we prefer at this point in time in this type of context of the laboratory what we are talking about. And so this is, I think, one thing. The second thing is that I would like to stress is, to my experience, and there has to be also a lot of research on that many professors, there are professors that do the same thing for their whole career, but that one of the advantages of professorship is that you can change your focus in your work during your career, and that things you were doing when you were 40 need not to be the same when you're doing 50. And some people find out new qualities amongst themselves when they become older and they get the opportunity to, for instance, to taste with from being a chair or having other responsibilities. They find out they are good at that. And so I think that we should not think of people as something static. Therefore, also, I think the development of perspective is important to say that people will change over their careers. And we're in a lot of discussion in many European countries about the number of people working between 50 and 65, or between the 50s and the pension age. Well, I think we have a lot of opportunities within universities to give people new tasks that are corresponding to their responsibilities, but also to their skills that they have developed over their careers and their interests that might be changing. And I think that we can keep them productive until the last day that they work for us, and hopefully even after. Like I'm retired already 2 years, but I still continue to work for my university. So I think there are so many possibilities and people should not be looked at very statically. But I think the essence is that you look at it from a team perspective, what is the kind of support and strengthening of the team that we need at this time? And sometimes it may be someone who is very good in software, someone good in communication, someone will be someone with a lot of publications. So this is different. This is the kind of diversity that we will see, and every situation will be different and has to be assessed on its own merits.
Pedro, queres comentar?
Yes, maybe I will comment Teresa's question about the evaluation of the evaluators. And I think there's two dimensions for that question. The first one is how you select the evaluators, and Dagmar already elaborated on that. But I can also add that, looking back, for example, to the associate laboratory that I coordinate, we have a scientific advisory board where we try to get the best scientists. And there's no algorithm, there's no metric. We really decide what are the more relevant scientific topics, for example, optimization of aircraft structures, and we try to get the best scientists available in that field. And like I said, it's a question is what it's called this team that someone has in the scientific community. So, and that results from a number of contributions, not only papers, the presentations, so all a number of contributions that result in this team that the scientific community has regarding that particular person, right? So, this is the first dimension. So the second one is how you evaluate the decisions that the evaluators made. So, and I think that the answer for that is accountability. So one must be responsible for the decisions that we make. So that must be a system in place where we are responsible for the decisions that we make in terms of hiring and promoting people. So these are the two dimensions that I see in terms of evaluating the evaluators.
Thank you. Any other comment on the other questions? We don't have much time, but if there are one or two important questions still from the... Yeah, go ahead. Another question? No? Okay, just this last question then. Where's the microphone, please?
Okay, thank you. Amadeu Soares from CESAM University of Aveiro. Well, not such a long time ago, I must remember everybody that is present, the recruitment and promotion process of the universities was not quantitative. And it is now quantitative because there was an imposition from the Court of Law. So if we don't change the general law, I doubt we can follow this path. So just a note, because we do need to change the law, otherwise we cannot do a process different than a quantitative one. That's my opinion.
That's why it was long-term modifications.
Okay, well, that's a very serious and dramatic point. Yeah, and the fact that it's an annual evaluation, which makes it difficult. I mean, how can you do, evaluation which takes a month or 2 months if it's annual? You can't. So anyway, that was just a comment. One last question? Yes.
The laws are not written in stone. They can be changed, right? Portugal has some tradition to change the law, so it's time maybe to do it. I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Clive.
This is interpretation of the law. Because I have participated in many universities calls for promotions or for hiring people. And they're very different. I mean, University of Coimbra has no numbers. There's no table.
Oh, well.
University of Braga, you have to put the impact factor. University of Porto, half and half. So this is interpretation. This is not law. The law is actually quite flexible. This is just a comment.
Oh, important. Thank you. Yep. Okay, well, our fourth and last speaker will be Helena Pereira, President of FCT. Thank you, Helena, for agreeing to give us your precious insights.
Well, thank you. These are just the last comments of this very, very intense session. Let me say that I am a bit puzzled. And I was here sitting and deciding what shall I say, because I think we are just mixing a lot of subjects together. depending on the experience and on the stage of who is listening to this. We are, for instance, one of the aspects is assessment related to calls and to success in calls, for instance, for researchers or for projects or whatever. And this is one thing. Another thing is how to be chosen in a call for a position, a university position or a research position. Another thing is how to assess an institution and things like that. And all these are very different. They are very different in the numbers involved. They are very different in the issues involved, and therefore on the practices that might be used. Starting with the case of FCT, which is one case that everyone likes to think about. In fact, we are doing for many years already what has been said here. We don't use numbers, metrics, use narratives. So, for instance, the calls for the researcher contracts, we are calling for a small narrative of the path of the person and things like that. That applies also, for instance, for PhD candidates. So we are using that. And somehow, when we are speaking, this is a very Portuguese culture, we speak as if it was in San Francisco that, I don't know, 12 years ago or whatever, they decided that. So we do a lot of good things already. But this is very different. For instance, the evaluation of the calls, these big calls, 5,000 candidates of FCT, it's impossible to have interviews, for instance. This is very different from, for instance, a position at university. And I am a strong believer in the institutions. And they have autonomy, and they should have. And I have to believe that they do what they think with the persons they have, what they think is best for them and their strategy. And of course, universities have autonomy, as have the research centers and the research institutes. They can do, as Claudio was saying, they can do as best as they think fit for their strategy. And also, one size does not fit all, of course. And even within an organization, within an institution, you may have differences. You may want different things at different times, for instance. So I'm a stronger believer in institutions. And also, we should avoid the things that are already past. For instance, at university level, hiring is differentiated from promotion already. So let's not repeat things that no longer exist or cannot exist. So that is why I am a bit puzzled on this assessment. As you know, I have been in the profession for many years, and I have assessed many things in Portugal and abroad. And at the end, it is the strategy, the intelligence of the institution that will make the best decisions and the best choices in the evaluation. So for us, what I think is that we should strengthen the institutions, universities, polytechnics, faculties, research centers, research laboratories, and so on. We should strengthen them and make them responsible for their strategic choices and intelligent choices. So that is, in this way, in my feeling, is that how we should work. We have, of course, as someone was talking about choosing the evaluators and things like that. Yes, of course. FCT chooses every year 1,000 evaluators, more or less, international evaluators. For having 1,000 evaluators, acting evaluators, FCT asks, in general, on average, 7,000, makes 7,000 invitations all over the world. So we are dealing with different things. This is very different from a position at university, where we have a couple of candidates and a dozen members in a jury. And by the way, there is another aspect that you might not be aware. In Portugal, we have in place other evaluation processes which are not very bad, related to the public administration. So the positions in the public administration, they have an evaluation with the different aspects. They are not metrics, or most of them are not quantified. They are evaluations of leadership, of initiative, of dealing with the colleagues and things like that. And this is in place. As well as, for instance, for choosing the higher position in the administrations, which is made by an institution, I don't know if you know about that, CRESAP. They also evaluate along different parameters, quite a lot, not quantified, again. So it is a best judgment and a belief in the people they choose as evaluators. So, I mean, we have a lot of things already in place. Of course, some things go wrong. We all have the experience of being in committees, in juries, when there are specific interests for something. So not so honest, not so fair. We have that experience. You should try to avoid that and make that, of course, someone said, I think it was Karin, accountable. Yes, and have consequences. So it's a final comment, a very mixed up and puzzled comment, but I think this subject is much more complex and diversified than just saying we should adopt DORA or whatever. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. So what do you suggest the next step should be? And with that, we will finish.
Well, it's not one next step. It's very different steps at all levels. But I think one important, very important step is done at the institutional level, at the university, at the faculty, at the research center. So the reasoning, the discussion within these organizations about what they want. Because finally, the decisions they will take on hiring, on promoting, and so ever, they will suffer the consequences of that. They will be either thrive in the future and be excellent, or on the contrary, they will slowly decline and lose power in the scientific world. So, again, I'm a strong believer in these institutions.
So, as people and researchers, we must question our institutions and continue debate in our own institutions and at a broader level as well. Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you for everything you've done for our scientific community as well. Yeah. Thank everybody.